What I would like to do this morning is speak to you a little bit about the ongoing Russian war in Ukraine and some key points maybe we could take away. Before we get into that discussion, could everybody please turn to the person next to you if you like, and I want you to talk to them. What is one thing that stands out to you about the Russian war in Ukraine thus far? Let's get talking, please. I imagine as you're speaking, there's a number of things that might be coming up. The first, perhaps, might be the notion that this is a difficult subject and that you have a lot of good men and women, Ukrainian and Russian, that are suffering as a result of this conflict. Another topic that might come up is the courage of the Ukrainian people, stories of heroism and bravery. Other things that might come up are disturbing, war crimes, and again, human suffering. But I want to speak to you about a few things in the next 15 minutes or so. The first, I want to touch on some of the core causes of the war. Now, that's more of an hour-long discussion. I've had a couple lunch talks in the upper school, and I would love to meet with the middle school and to talk about this in greater depth. Although I know you have been speaking about this with Miss Russell and Miss Mandeville. Some of the causes of the war. The second major thing I want to touch on is the issue of where courage comes from. How is it that individuals, and I don't just mean presidents, I mean people of all ages, can find themselves in extraordinary situations and behave with great character and great courage. And then the third major thing I want to touch on is oftentimes what we might call evil, but by evil we mean actions that lack empathy for a fellow man and woman. How do we make sense of actions that demonstrate a lack of empathy for others' suffering, and the mindset through which people oftentimes behave in that fashion, in this case on a global level in an international war? At the very core of a discussion of the war in Ukraine, and I think this should be the end-all, be-all point about military conflicts anywhere, so we're talking about real human beings, people like us who find themselves caught up in difficult moments. War itself is something that is obscene. It is awful. Wars happen. Tragic wars happen. And at the core of that is the story of real people. That's the most important thing, I think, that we should begin to talk about when we think about military conflicts. How does this affect real people who deserve our compassion? And as these conflicts play out with real people involved, we have the intellectual obligation and the moral obligation to try to make sense of it. How do these things happen? How is it that we can begin to understand things like an international conflict between Russia and Ukraine is not only something that's sad and upsetting and wrong, but something that's explicable. By explicable, I mean that we can try to understand. The purpose of being a historian or being someone who is an aspiring student is to not accept that horrible things are happening because we cannot explain them, but that horrible things happen for explicable reasons. We try to explain some things we will never get to the bottom of, but we will aspire to because we have the obligation to do that for men and women caught up in the midst of these struggles. So when you think about a military conflict, you might think of kind of like the Rambo-esque figure, At the core of it are oftentimes ordinary young people, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, Ukrainian and Russian. And this is a key point before we go further. We mourn what is happening in Ukraine, and we condemn Vladimir Putin's government. We mourn suffering on all sides. We don't demonize the Russian people, which is a great people with an extraordinary history. We be forthright about saying what we find to be utterly wrong and abhorrent, but we recognize at the core of that are the story of kids like this who are caught up in this struggle. So what are the important causes of the war? Why is this happening? That's a much larger discussion. Can someone raise your hand if you think you can tell me a core cause of the war? Yes, what's your name? Adelino, please. So what do you think is a core cause of the war? So, Adelino, that is a spectacular answer. That was a much more specific answer than I was expecting. So our middle school is apparently, as we all know, phenomenal. So let's just give a round of applause for that answer. So Adelino is referencing, if you look here, you see Crimea, and you see a separatist-controlled area. Ukrainians would note of the current war, which this five-front invasion by Russia began on five-front Russian invasion into Ukraine began on February 24th. But my middle school friend would note, well, in many ways, this war has been ongoing since 2014, when you had Russia forcibly annex Crimea and a separatist-controlled area, the Donbass, which has a couple major cities. So that is a crucial part of it. If we look at the causes of the war, there are a few things I would like to touch on, which again begs a much, much longer discussion. One, the legacy of the Soviet Union. When we think about the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, created in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917, a Soviet Union, a communist, ultimately superpower post-World War II. Vladimir Putin, about whom we'll be speaking in a little bit, grew up in the Soviet Union. Russia, not just Russia, but Russia joined with other Soviet socialist republics as a world power. The collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991, which Vladimir Putin experienced, and he was on the front lines of it, if you will, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in East Germany. Vladimir Putin has referred to that as one of the greatest geopolitical catastrophes of the 20th century, which is a strong comment. So in one sense, we might think of Vladimir Putin's nostalgia for the Soviet Union, imperial Russian ambitions to create this larger Russian empire, if you will. This can also be tied back to Russian security concerns coming out of the Second World War, a conflict in which the Russian people lost, the Soviet people, lost 22 to 27 million people, roughly 1 out of 5 people in the Soviet Union. So when we talk about perceived security threats, this is not entirely disingenuous at all from when we consider Putin's viewpoint. This is something we should take seriously. The Russian perspective of the map of Eastern Europe, the Ukraine, by the way, meaning the border, that there's a crucial security buffer there for Russia. And NATO, can someone yell? It's probably going to be from middle school because they're brilliant. What does NATO mean? Anyone over here? Yes, you. Yes, what's your name? I'm sorry? Jack. Can we give an appropriate round of applause for Jack? Okay, please, can we scream now for Jack? That was actually a practice run. Can we go, for Jack, please? On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, Jack! Adelino's like, why didn't they scream for me? Can we scream for Adelino on the count of 3? 1, 2, 3. Yeah! I'm not sure if that feels good, but next time we'll clap. Thank you both very much. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in short, a security alliance created post-World War II to contain the threat of the Soviet Union. NATO means that any member of that alliance, if they are attacked by another power, every member of that alliance will fight to protect that power. NATO has expanded since the collapse of the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe. It now encompasses the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And the question was, should Ukraine join NATO or not? The Ukrainian response to Russian demands that they should not be allowed to join NATO was, we will if we want to. We cannot guarantee you that we want. Another major factor here is Putin's fear of democracy. Vladimir Putin would argue, in contrast to what we might say, that he sees democracy as inherently destabilizing and problematic. He would emphasize that Russia, as a democratic state in the 1990s, was a period of total chaos and very real suffering for the Russian people with the collapse of communism. Vladimir Putin would look at Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and make a case against democracy. But in riots, as you'll talk about, a much more Hobbesian, Leviathan-type view of the world. But if you don't know what that means, we'll get there in riots. Don't worry, you're going to do great, middle schoolers. You're going to do wonderfully. So when there have been democratic protests in places like Belarus next to Russia, Putin has been very ardent in trying to stop that from potentially toppling the government there. And there's a real fear of Ukraine as a genuine democracy on Russia's border that it cannot control. What is the status of the conflict today? The conflict currently looks like this. You can see the red areas of Russian control. The striped areas are contested areas. In the opening weeks of the war, Any Russian expectation of a quick collapse of the Ukrainian government proved a terrible, terrible blunder, and that the Ukrainian government would not collapse and the Ukrainian people would fight courageously to protect their country. North of Kyiv, there's been a major Russian retreat in which the Ukrainian army succeeded in beating back that part of the invasion. What is likely going to unfold in coming weeks is a massive Russian attack in Ukraine's east, coming out of the Donbass, that's going to try to cut off or trap Ukraine's best forces in the east. That is something we should be looking towards in the next few weeks is happening. The Ukrainian government is calling urgently for aid from European powers and the United States to help beat back what will probably be a much more World War II style attack in an open area of plains, different from north of Kyiv. If you are interested in getting more information about the war, a reliable source is the British Defense Ministry. They are posting updates every day of what is happening. And so that is a way you can kind of find out concrete information on what is going on in the war. The British Ministry of Defense releases these intelligence updates. But I want to talk about people for a few minutes. I want to talk about people and not only the status of what is going and why this war has happened. Who is this here on the right? Can you yell for me? Okay, who is this here? This is kind of an unsettling aesthetic contrast between the Ukrainian president and the Russian President Putin meeting with his defense minister, Zelensky meeting with his. So, who is Vladimir Zelensky? What was Vladimir Zelensky's profession before? Yes, God, middle school is my jam. Y'all are great. Okay, yes, you in the red sweatshirt. Yes, he was indeed a comedian. He was a performer. Now we're going to get into a question of where does great courage come from? I'm sure Vladimir Zelensky is not a perfect person, but one key thing we can note about Zelensky, he's shown great courage in his willingness to stand up for his people. Existential courage, meaning he has put his life at risk. But who is this guy? Where did he come from? This is him in his 20s in Prague. Here is Zelensky on Servant of the People, in which he plays a teacher who has an anti-corruption rant about the corruption of the government, runs for the presidency, wins, and then he actually ran for the presidency in real life and won. That's how you know it's a democracy. Things like that happen in a democracy. So Zelensky. Also, you may not know that Zelensky was Ukraine's Dancing with the Stars champion. There's a phenomenal YouTube clip of Zelensky being fierce on the dance floor. Vladimir Zelensky. Yeah, we can clap for that. Yeah. I repeat my opening question. Where does courage come from? From whom does it arise? Vladimir Zelensky, in many ways extraordinary, but in many ways an ordinary person from a background of show business, of performance, has been someone who has shown immense courage to stand up in a struggle that is very disturbing and upsetting, and to say that we are not afraid of anything or anyone. And when he said this before the Russian invasion, the expectation was it's easy to say those things. It's different to have them play out in reality. They played out in reality for Zelensky, and he didn't budge. And the expectation that he would quickly flee Kyiv once Russian bombs started falling. Zelensky's response, as you know, is, I need ammunition, not a ride. There was going to be no evacuation. He was going to stand strong, not just for his people, but with his people standing strong. Courage and leadership coming from unexpected sources, perhaps, but something that maybe speaks to what we should try to recognize. No one knows how they would behave in such a circumstance, but every one of you should know that you have the character to do the right thing in difficult circumstances. We won't always be perfect. Sometimes we will crumble, but know that within you there is the courage to try to do the right thing in difficult circumstances. And Zelensky has shown that. I didn't expect it to be this hard, says Zelensky. You can't imagine what it means or how well you'll do as president. The Russian attack has pushed his leadership into the unknown. He leans back in his chair. I'm not a hero. That is the achievement of his people, he says. Zelensky believes one man cannot control everything. As the country looks for every way to defeat Russia on the battleground, a belief in the power of individual people choosing to stand together as one may turn out to be Ukraine's saving grace. Here's a story of just that. The story of Katia Vlasenko, a 16-year-old girl who, as her family was fleeing town before invading forces, her family's car was fired upon by soldiers, and her instinct was to cover her 8-year-old little brother. She sheltered her 8-year-old little brother. She was shot 3 times through the back, and her parents thought she was dead. She survived. That's what courage looks like. And it's not always a president that best represents that. In this case, it's a 16-year-old young woman who acted with great courage. What is courage about? It's not about us. It's about what we do for others, right? It's about selflessness, a willingness to do that. Zelensky came and visited her. He brought her white and pink flowers, and Zelensky said, "It's not easy, but we do the right thing." Lysenko, who was wounded, she replied, "And everybody supports you on TikTok," prompting a smile from the president and members of his entourage. And he replied, "So we've occupied TikTok. All talk about you. It's all about you." And so we think about someone like Vladimir Putin, who has, we think about someone like Vladimir Putin, who is the one responsible, he and his government, for war crimes in Ukraine. But Vladimir Putin is also a human being. And we have the obligation to grapple with the humanity of inhumanity. And why Vladimir Putin thinks what he is doing is right. That's a disturbing conversation, a troubling one, but one that we must engage just the same. One that is not best served by simply only condemning Vladimir Putin, but seeking to understand who he is as a human being. Why does he think this is right, what is happening, even as we can see that it is so upsetting and so disturbing? That is a much larger conversation which we must have. But at the same time, no, within Russia, there have been tens of thousands of courageous Russians that have stood against this war. I repeat, we must not demonize the Russian people, even as we seek to hold the Russian government and military commanders and some soldiers accountable for what has happened. There are Russians speaking out, like a former Russian newscaster, Marina Osvnikova, who went on during a live broadcast to hold up a sign, "No war, stop the war, don't believe the propaganda, they're lying to you here, Russians against war." That was a courageous move, and it wasn't about her. It was about a lot of other people, and this moment is her giving up, ultimately, her career. She's going to suffer for this, and she was willing to do it. Tens of thousands of Russians have been arrested protesting the war, and we cannot know the exact number of how many more are against it. Before I stop and invite Raj on, who's going to play an outro song for us today, even as we strongly condemn Vladimir Putin and the Russian government, let us not forget the words of John F. Kennedy at the height of the Cold War at American University in June 1963. "No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. We can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, and economic and industrial growth, and culture and in acts of courage. Almost unique among the major world powers, we, the United States and Russia, have never been at war with each other. Let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interest and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. In the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." As we speak strongly against Russian war crimes in Ukraine, as we applaud the Ukrainian people for acts of resistance and courage before that tyranny, we look towards a future rooted in this ending and beginning point. The humanity of people like ourselves caught up in this struggle. Not just Ukrainians, not just Russians, but a world that we all inhabit, a world in which we all want to be happy and have our family be happy. That is the most important takeaway here, ending and beginning. Now, I'd like, before I invite Raj on in a second, to note, I'll be hosting another lunch conversation in a couple of weeks where we can go to have a more in-depth conversation about this. I'm interested in what you have to say, and I want to engage with you, particularly in the middle school, because we have a lot of brilliant minds there. So thank you for your attention.